So what I did was to really very carefully position my talk this morning to talk about the fact that we are in a green lash today and that we need to discuss it. We cannot put our heads in the ground and think that no, Trump will go away and all the world will come together and we'll be living in peace again. That peace is going to have to be hard fought and hard made. And I think that for us has to be the lesson that we come out with. What do we do? So firstly, let's be clear. There are many wars in the world, and each war impacts the other. So these are not, when there is a war in Gaza and human beings are being killed and maimed, that polarizes the world, that divides the world. You can't build a cooperative agreement on climate change if the world is so much divided and in such deep distrust of the other. So the human wars have as much impact as the war with nature, which we are definitely losing. The war with climate change, the revenge of nature, as I say it, it's so visible in our world and it's visible across the region. And we know that that is happening. The war with China, which is now today become the most tense geopolitical issue in the world, is literally making the green transition more difficult, because we know that China dominates the supply chain for the batteries, for the lithium, the cobalt, the graphite, and the solar technology. Now, instead of embracing that, today the world is divided between whether the supply chain, can we trust the supply chain or not? And if you look at the United States and deep down why they distrust a lot of these technologies, forget the fossil fuel dominance. But there's another factor, which is we don't want this to happen because this is China. So we are really making, in all the wars, and all the wars are playing with each other, we are making climate change and the future we believe in even more difficult. And this is where in Europe and in the United States, it isn't happening in our world yet, but in your world, where in 2024, half the population voted, and yet we got a vote against climate change. And we have to understand that fear and insecurity is leading to these changes. There is a fear of immigration, which you know very clearly. There is a fear of climate change policies, whether it's the price of energy or whether it is the farmers who in European Union are subsidized to an absolutely obscene level, are telling us that they cannot go green because of the high costs of going green. And I tell my European friends this, that when you come to India and you tell us to go green, please understand our farmers are working at the margins of survival. They do not get that subsidy. And you have to understand the costs that are there. And that is something that we need to discuss. There is, of course, the fear of the rich being left out of jobs, the whole globalization and the deglobalization that is happening. But what struck me most was when I looked at the data from Europe, I found that it was the young, and many of you are here, so forgive me, but I could not understand this. How are the young voting for parties who are so clearly against climate change? These are not even polite people on the other side. They say that if they come to power, they will take out the windmills, they will go coal again. They do not want the electrification agenda to succeed. So there are parties who are overtly saying that climate change does not matter. Maybe not as clearly and as rudely as Trump does, but they're saying it. And yet you're getting a vote for it. And this, at a time when it is not John and my time, when we talked about climate change, and I was at Rio in 1992, when we talked about climate change in 1992, it was a far-off issue, something that may happen. It was about the models that scientists were putting out that would predict that climate change would be a reality. Today, it is a reality because we are seeing it happen. And yet at a time when the world is seeing the impacts of climate change, you're seeing this push against. Quite honestly, and I'm being very clear to you, I'm old at this. I had never thought that we'd come at a time when the impacts would be so clear and populations would move backwards rather than forward. My assumption was that as the impacts became clearer, people would move towards taking more action. And this is the impact of climate change that we have to understand, is the fact that we are seeing now increased frequency of these events. I said that we call this in our part of the world the revenge of nature. But what we have to understand that these impacts are hurting the poorest in our world. I heard that from many of you yesterday, and I'm only reiterating this, that we have to understand that the human face of climate change is about that farmer, about that laborer, about the fisherman who cannot anymore deal with the increased frequency and intensity of the events. And they are impacted, and this is coming at the back of poverty. So again, and I will come to it, climate change is an exacerbating factor. It is not the reason why people are poor today. People are poor, but climate change is making them poorer. And that's important for climate scientists, for all of us to articulate, because otherwise we become, climate change doesn't make people poor. No, it impoverishes them because they lose their ability to be able to cope. So my organization does something called the State of Extreme Weather Events in India. We do this annually. We put together data from the Indian Meteorological Department, which has a daily report on extreme weather events in India. We tried to do it for Africa, but we are not getting that kind of data. But it's a daily report. And they have defined extreme weather. So they have said extreme rain means when it rains beyond this level. Extreme cloud landslide, whatever. So they have a whole definition of extreme weather events. When we put this database together and we release it each year, and the database is actually available for free on our website, where you can go and play with the numbers. You can see what the issues are, which state is most impacted by what. And it's only data from two government sources in India, the Indian Meteorological Department and the Department of Home Affairs, which tracks the level of deaths and crop damage. We are getting to almost one extreme weather event a day in India. We don't have data for the Indian subcontinent, but for India. And this literally is breaking the backs of the poor. So if you look at this, it's heavy rain, it's cold days, it's lightning and storms. So each issue is put together, and these are definitions by the Indian Meteorological Department. The first quarter of 2025 stands out as the wettest start. We had huge floods, landslides on 80 out of 90 days. We also track displacement, internal displacement. Because remember, internal displacement does not mean that you're getting hordes of Indians coming to Austria. Please be clear. It's internal displacement means people lose the ability to cope, and they then move from their village to the nearest city. And it isn't, so those are some things that get tracked. And we basically found that floods accounted for 64% of the displacement, followed by storms. And the most important thing that we have to understand is that it's not one flood. We've lived with floods, okay? I mean, I come from a country where heat, you're all talking about heat at 33 degrees. We are 46 degrees. So we have heat. It's heat. We have floods. We've grown up with floods. We've had droughts. You have the seasons in India, which have always been there. What you're seeing now is one big difference. You're seeing now repeated, increasing intensity. So you just about recover from one flood, and then you get a pest incidence. You recover from that, and then suddenly you get a really cold wave. and your crops that you managed to survive over the post-flood period die because of the cold wave. So it's the increasing frequency of it. And this takes away the development dividend. So governments invest money to build homes, to build houses. People invest in livestock. Remember, and you know this, our biggest asset in our part of the world is a cattle, a goat. That's the assets of the poor. And the most difficult is to rebuild that asset base again. And so as they become more insecure, they move, they migrate from cities to new countries. And that's part of the first thing I said, your fear of immigration. A lot of it is also related to, and that's the super cycle that we need to start talking about, because that super cycle is about this super cycle as well. But it's complex. And that's particularly important for scientists at IIASA because our language has to be carefully tempered. I hate the word climate refugee. I don't think there is anything called a climate refugee. Nobody leaves their home because of climate change. They leave their home because there is an exacerbating factor called climate change. They're already poor. They are hit because of higher farmers in our world, are hit because of increased input costs. Ecosystems are vulnerable because of bad development. We're building roads in the highest of the mountain regions so that every time we do have a landslide, it ends up getting even worse. So these are exacerbating factors. And also, there is no migration because of one extreme event. I mean, you're all people who are so well aware of this that I don't have to keep, that I just have to reiterate what you already know, that the poor in the world are actually far more resilient than people like us. But today we are getting to a point where they are even losing their ability to cope. Now that says it. That's really extreme when they lose their ability. But then let's add to it the insecurity of the globalized, of the rich world. I write about this a lot, calling this the revenge of the rich. And I call this because if you look at it, economic globalization happened at the backs of the poor in the world. I mean, John has just told you how old I am, so I can tell you that I was part of, in India when GATT was moving to become WTO, we were big protests on the road in India because it was seen to be globalization of rules of trade that would impact the poorest farmers in our world, which would impact the poorest people in our world. And so there was a huge protest against it. And if you remember, John, at that time, Larry Summers, who was in the World Bank, actually wrote a memo which got leaked, which said that globalization makes so much sense, economic globalization, because you move production, manufacturing to places where there is no cost of labor, and you move it because there is no environmental standards there. And he had this obnoxious phrase about how if there is cancer in the rich world, people get worried. But cancer in the poor world, not an issue. That was the logic of economic globalization. Now, this also meant that countries could export their production and so emissions. And if you look at the data for China, it is so clear that the minute China joins WTO in 2001, the emissions go like this. But it's not China, it's the economic globalization model that we framed in which all that production would move to China, and China just benefited from an amazing rulemaking that was done by the rich to help them become richer. It was not done to make the world richer. And today, there is anger against this because manufacturing has gone, and there is an anger against moving manufacturing back. The question today is, and that's a big question for all of us, is where will the labor come from? Because that's what, if you look at the H-1B visas in the US, it's such a classic tale that you moved the all manufacturing to the other part of the world. You did, most of our software companies became rich because they could do all your call centers and everything. Now you want the same techies from India to be in the United States because they are the brains that you need. But they're also cheaper than the brains that you have. So that's really what the issue today at the core of it is. For people like us, and for me, and for John, and for all of you in the room, the question is, if you bring manufacturing back to Europe and the US, what will be the costs on climate change today? Because there was a whole period where emissions were exported. Countries like India, China, Vietnam, Cambodia have all benefited from that globalization model. At least certain people in those countries have benefited, some more than others. In India, where there is democracy and we could fight against water pollution and have better standards, we were always accused of saying, oh, look at what you're doing as compared to China. Because China has no standards for this, so they could go ahead. I think China has become much more aware. They've become much more conscious of these issues. The question is going to be, what will this do now to the world? So one super cycle is impacting another super cycle. And in this, we have Mr. Trump, who has openly denied climate change. I was asked to speak at a very interesting conference, and I went deliberately this year to the largest oil and gas companies conference called the CERAWeek in Houston at the beginning of this year. I'd gone last year when things were different. This year, I went only because I wanted to see the mood over there. And it is a very clear mood. And don't underwrite this. Don't all of us put our heads in the sand and say, oh, no, renewables will succeed in the United States. If governments go after oil and gas, remember in Biden's time, which all of us hold up as the sort of beacon of environmentalism, in Biden's time, the United States was already drilling, manufacturing, and exporting the largest oil and gas in the history of mankind, 13 million barrels. Trump is only going to make sure that whatever moves there were, the subsidies, the incentives to move towards the green industry, he definitely wants to make sure that he can change that. My worry, again, is US emissions had peaked. We didn't see decline. Let's be clear. There was a talk about a 50% reduction by 2030. Every time we looked at the data, it was said, no, now Biden's Inflation Act will come into place, and now renewables will step up, and now this will happen, and you will see a reduction by 2030. Okay? What I suspect now and worry about now is that you may actually see an increase. And I see this because of AI. There is so much need for energy in the AI centers. And one of the reasons why captive coal and captive nuclear is being discussed in the US, because their grid cannot take it anymore if they have that increase, that amount of energy need that is increased. And this, remember, is when the world is close to exhausting that carbon budget that John talked about to keep the world below 1.5 degrees centigrade. If you look at this tells you two things. One, this is an annual data in terms of emissions. We put what we call the 7 historical emitters, which are, you'll see, they have always been high. They've always taken up the emissions. Then came China, which is fascinating because China increased from the year when it joined the WTO, and it's taken over. And then came, of course, the rest of the world. India is in that green and then the rest of the world in blue. That's what annual emissions look like. Now, if you look at the budget on this side, we put together a budget for 1870 2019, and then we put together a budget for 1870 to 2030. Now, this 2030 figure includes all the NDCs, including the 50% reduction that the US has promised. Now, if that happens, then the US share actually goes down from 24% to 22% of the budget, but nominal, okay? China's share goes up from 13% to 16% of the budget. India remains at 3 to 4%, and the rest of the world, and this is the number that we have to remember, the rest of the world, that's 70% of the world's population. I've taken China out of the equation. 70% of the world population has a carbon budget, which is already in danger of being exhausted, of 30%. And the question, and this is the big question that we have in front of us, because this can be a lesson in morality. You can say, oh, we don't care about all this. Our forefathers used the carbon space. We had the right to do so. We didn't know about climate change at that time. We grew our economies as a result of it. Don't come and tell us today that we should have done something different. It's over. The cake is eaten. There are some crumbs left. Eat the crumbs. That's literally what is the conversation. Now, I can argue, fine, that's okay, you're powerful, you can go and bomb another country in any case, so you're powerful, you can do what you want. Let me go home. But the point is, my home needs development, and you can't wish the poor away. So the question is, what will happen? Now, you can argue that the poor cannot grow, cannot develop. I mean, we will develop. Okay? Now, what happens? The millions in the world need the space to grow, and this growth will add to emissions. It will add to climate risks. So you cannot anymore say that equity, climate justice is something that is a nice thing, but it is not practical in the world of Trump. The fact is, even in the world of Trump, this is the reality. You have emissions which have grown. The pie is already eaten, yet there are millions in the world that need the space to grow. And I'm adding to it something which is a realization of the past few years, that the cost of transition is not cheap or easy. I used to argue this to my Western friends all the time, who were always telling me, oh, we made mistakes in the past. But why doesn't India go solar? And I would always say, listen, there are costs to this. We're a country which cannot even afford basic energy. There are costs to it. No. The cost of solar has dropped. Go solar. And today, that same European world, the same American, European, Japan, New Zealand, Australia, all the world is telling us that our people are against climate change because the cost of energy is going up. Right, wrong, I don't know. But the votes are definitely going for the parties who are able to shout louder and say that climate change is making your life more difficult. Now, this is clearly something that we need to understand, because as I will argue with you, we need to change the narrative so that we can get what we want, which is to move decisively on climate change, but not ignore development. And that, to me, is why climate justice is an imperative, but also the change of narrative is needed. I've already talked about this, but the fact is we are running out of time. Emission reduction is not at the scale that we need. Wars are defeating the momentum. After Ukraine, I remember so clearly that I think Sharm el-Sheikh was the first conference. One of the COPs, everyone was talking about how keep it in the ground, no gas, no oil, coal. Now, one of my points of difference with a lot of my European colleagues, and remember, we work very closely. I mean, John is unique, but I do work with other European and other colleagues in the world, is I would always argue, so you've moved from coal to gas. How is that better? And they would say, no, gas is much better. Don't worry, gas is much better. And yesterday, Karl Pope wrote an editorial in the New York Times where he said that he, as an environmentalist, made the biggest mistake of his life when he advocated for Sierra Club to move to support gas. Okay? Now, I support gas because we need gas in India for local air pollution gains. We are the one group which fought for gas in the city of Delhi and made a transition to 100,000 vehicles running on gas in a matter of 2 years. But how can you talk to me about coal and not put gas in the same conversation? Is it because, I don't want to be racist, but is it because one is black and the other is white? John told me to be myself today, so I'm taking the privilege to be myself in the presence of John. So please forgive me when I say this. But I'm asking ourselves, when I would read The Guardian and I would read all the other papers talking about how coal needs to go, and I would say, yeah, fossil fuel needs to go. We need to talk about fossil. No, methane is under control. CO2 in coal is double of gas. Double? But if you double the use of gas, it becomes equal, right? So how is gas cleaner? And now I found it so interesting that the same groups, and this is the hypocrisy in the world, that you have to understand the world is interconnected today. Maybe in 1991, when we did global warming in an unequal world, a case of environmental colonialism, and took on WRI, we were far away in Delhi. There was hardly any email, internet, nothing. Today, the world is one. And we do see this hypocrisy that till yesterday you were asking us to keep it in the ground, and then the Ukraine war comes and your cheap gas from Russia disappears, and suddenly you're all over the world building your LNG stations and trying to source gas from Africa. Same countries that you said keep it in the ground. So I think these are things that we have to understand as academics. We are scientists, we are academics. We have to understand the reality and not brush it on the other side. Then, of course, finance is not adding up. We did a report, and my colleagues are right now going to be in Seville in Spain, where we're looking at debt and climate change. But we basically found that money was not going where it was needed. Money was not grant or debt, but debt or loans. I find it most interesting that when everyone talked about Pakistan, our neighbor, and talked about the floods in Pakistan, terrible floods in Pakistan, and then did a conference of donors to help Pakistan reconstruct, the money was given as equity. Now, what does it do to a country which is already under huge debt? The calculation that we have just put out in the latest issue of Down to Earth on our new report is that the annual interest payments of the world's most vulnerable countries is equivalent to the money that they have asked for their NDCs. So we have to understand the scale of the burden on the countries. The cost of capital. Look at Africa. It pays 20% interest rates for countries which have never had a problem in terms of repayment. But there is a risk because of governments. There is a risk, and they pay these high rates. And these are the same countries which are now being hit by extreme weather events, and that is only making it worse because they have the impacts of extreme weather events, and now they have the increasing inability to be able to build and to be able to do what we all want, which is the green transition. And we did a report a year ago because everyone kept telling us, don't worry, now private capital will come in and everything will be okay. So we looked at the voluntary carbon market and we put out this report called Discredited. India is the second largest supplier of credits in the voluntary carbon market. And I won't bore you with it, but the bottom line of it was that it was not working, not even for the planet. Forget the poor. It wasn't working for the planet. Only people it was working for was for the army of consultants and verifiers and auditors and every other people who were in the business of carbon credit. So we need to make sure that none of this survives. So let's put this now. I need to now talk to you. What do? We know this is the world. This is the state of the world. What do we do in our world? And that's where I change the discourse. At least in India, I say very clearly, we don't have to worry about climate change. It's not our reason. It's not our driver for action. We need to worry about climate change because we can't afford not to act. We need to do environmental management for our sakes. We need to reduce the health burden of pollution, provide water security at times when there is going to be more rain because of climate change, and therefore there's going to be more pollution of the rains. We need livelihood security to the farmers. We need to act. So the agenda for us, and I love the fact that you have also got that as part of your agenda, is the co-benefit agenda. For us, development is important. And environmental sustainability is critical because otherwise you will lose the gains of development. But if you can do both, you get the co-benefit of getting climate benefits. And that's the way we are framing it in our world. But this means that we have to reinvent what we mean by environment. And I'm talking, I don't know how many Europeans are in this room, so forgive me, I'm in Austria, so I keep thinking you're all Europeans, not an international center. But still, I want to address you because in some senses, the Western way of environmental management just does not work for us. We have to reinvent it in a very, very different way, because this is an extremely high cost approach to environmental management. You keep fixing something as it gets broken. So you move to cleaner fuel in your vehicles, you moved your emission standards, you improved it, you got rid of diesel, then you found out you had a NOx problem, then you put a de-NOx catalyst in the car, and you thought you had fixed NOx, then you find out that the scale of emissions, particulates has gone so small that you need another after treatment device. You need to improve the quality of your fuel even better. So this is a high cost approach to environmental management. And my argument to our world is if the richest people in the world, and in some senses what has happened with the elections last year, with Donald Trump coming in, should be a wake-up call. That you cannot afford not to understand that this method of environmental management is too costly, even for you. Forget countries like us. We cannot clean up pollution after it has happened. We have to prevent the pollution from happening. We have to think of very smart ways in which that pollution itself becomes a resource. And we have to do that in a way keeping in mind that anything that is expensive, is capital intensive, adds to resource inequality in our world, and adds to increased poverty in our world. So for us, if it has to be inclusive, it has to be affordable. And if it's affordable, only then can it be sustainable. So if you look at this, we basically are finding today that temperatures are increasing across the cities of India. But what is even more worrying is that the difference between the daytime temperature and the nighttime temperature is decreasing. So we are getting warmer nights. Now, warmer nights means that the human body has no ability to be able to cope. John already talked about it, but I would urge you, if you're interested in this, please go and see. We've just come up with a whole series of both reports and films on the impact of heat on the poorest in our world. And when we went out last year, my colleagues went out to ask, they literally found that there was evidence of laborers dying at night because they could not cope. And now Lancet has come up with a fascinating report which explains why the nighttime cooling was so important in our world, because it allowed bodies to be able to recover. But the point I want to make here is that this increased heat is not only about climate change. It is climate change, but not only climate change. It is also the way we are building our cities. We're destroying our green areas. We're destroying our water bodies. We have more concrete on the roads. We have more vehicles which give out heat during the day. And worse, as it gets hotter, we are using more air conditioners. And that means that you're adding to the heat island of your cities. And the difference between, so on one hand, you have climate change because of which you're getting the heat spikes. On the other hand, we're doing everything as humans to make sure that the impacts of that get exacerbated. But the question for us, and I particularly wanted to talk about this because I know John's interest in the built environment, is that we have to change the whole discourse on built environment. Today, the built environment discourse is led by doing something wrong and then retrofitting it with something right. Okay, so you build. I've even been noticing across Vienna, you have glass buildings as modern buildings. Now, I don't know how it works in Vienna, but in our part of the world, it's a nightmare because you're trapping the heat. And then you say, I need double insulated glass. I need efficient air conditioning. In our part of the world, heat management of our buildings is something that we've always known. It was ventilation. It's how your skin breathes. We never had our traditional buildings were all built with windows that could be opened. You first planned on the movement of wind rather than planned on the siting of buildings. We've just done a report for the government of India where we have an affordable building program. And we're saying the first thing you can do is in your site plan with developers, look at the wind flow models, because how the wind flows is critical for making sure that you can have thermal comfort. The other word we have to get rid of is air conditioning. It's thermal comfort. And thermal comfort has nothing to do with air conditioning. It's to do with the combination of ventilation. It's to do with the combination of how you have made your building so that you don't have the direct sunlight falling on you. So passive architecture, as it is known, needs to come in. So we need to make sure that all those issues happen in our interests. So as I said, we need to rework growth. We need development without pollution. We cannot afford to clean up after we have added. And this is why we need to reinvent the narrative of environmental management. And I would argue with all of you, put politics at the center of it. And when I say politics, I don't mean party politics. I mean societal politics. It is about the politics of inclusion. Then we find answers that we want to move ahead. I could go on, but I want to quickly flash to you some of the things that we have been working on in India to ask for this change of narrative. So when it comes to air pollution, we're saying stop looking at the tailpipe, stop looking at the quality of fuel. I mean, that's important, but that's not the answer. Talk about how you make people walk, drive, and cycle in your cities. In our part of the world, the majority of people still cycle, and they don't do it because they're rich. They do it because they're poor. They cannot even afford to take a bus. So the reinvention of mobility becomes critical. I've just written a 2-part article, which got me a lot of criticism, but I argued, why does India do an electric car program? We don't need electric cars. We need electric buses. The cars for the rich should, in any case, whether they buy one diesel car or one electric car, doesn't help me because it adds to the congestion on the roads. So our electrification agenda is about mobility transition. I spend a lot of my time working on shit. It's my area that I could take days of lecture with you. Okay? I have found it fascinating to understand how excreta explains to us the way that we are building an inclusive society, and that is leading to the pollution of our rivers. But the good thing is that this debate in India has gone quite far, because now the government of India has agreed that we will move cities to now local water harvesting and non-sewered sanitation systems. But the most interesting part of it is that you take your sewage, you take your excreta, you treat it, and then you put it back on the soil. You close the nitrogen cycle. This, I keep giving this as an example in our world, and I will take a second to explain it to you. I keep saying, in our world, when I was growing up, we could not even get a telephone line because it was land-based. We then moved to mobile systems, satellite, and today, famously known, there are more cell phones in India than there are toilets. But why don't we do that with sanitation? Why do we need to build land sanitation systems so that we have underground sewage? Why can't we just be much more nimble? Because the reality in India is, and I'm not showing it to you today, but we've done shit flow diagrams for almost all cities of India and Africa, where you basically find that the majority of people are on what is called on-site sanitation, which means that they have their own toilet connected to a septic tank. In the past, septic tank technologies have gone backward because those engineers who understood septic tanks were told, oh, that's all old-fashioned. You don't do septic tanks now. We do flush toilets. And people get confused between a flush toilet, which is a receptacle for holding your... As I said, I could go on about this. Okay, it's my area of... I've spent too much on this, okay? So some other time. But most interesting thing in India right now has been that how in the last 10 years I can see you. I know you're the watchkeeper. Yes. And I know I'm losing. Just 2 more minutes, okay? The waste and the garbage issue in our cities, when our new prime minister, new, old, whatever, our prime minister came, he said, I want to make Clean India the mission. And the first thing he did was to take a broom and start cleaning. And we came out and saying, visible cleaning does not equal cleaning of cities. And it's very important for us to understand that we are too poor a country to waste land for waste. We need to reprocess every bit of waste so that it becomes a resource. But that means making sure that you segregate at the household level. You can reprocess the waste. Today, we just did a new report, which is fascinating. The government of India has come up with a very interesting program to fund bio-CNG projects using municipal wet waste. And what this does is to essentially make a value chain out of your wet waste so that cities can use it to make gas. And the government of India has come up with a buyback program in which that gas is bought at commercial rates. So it's an interesting way to use waste. As I said, my whole interest is reinvent, rework so that you can actually have affordable systems and you can make sure that you can take your pollution and not treat it as pollution. Same thing we are doing with industrial pollution. Fly ash is one of our classic examples where fly ash from thermal power plants has become a way to decarbonize the cement industry because you replace limestone. We are now looking at iron ore slag to be able to replace the fuel used in the cement industry. So how do you combine? These are essentially, we've just done a new report for Africa. Because what is our interest in this? Please understand, our interest is our regulators are too weak. They don't have the money to be able to go and inspect every factory. And as a result, you have pollution. And we're not going to be able to change that. So can we find other ways in which that pollution, that factory which pollutes actually has an incentive to take what is its waste and turn it into a resource? And that's a very interesting conversation we're happening with the pollution inspectors in India. Of course, this has to be done keeping in mind that the pollution from one doesn't become the pollution of the other, that the waste from one doesn't become the waste of another. We have a laboratory, so we test, going back to my fecal sludge, we actually test the organic compost which comes out of the fecal sludge plants to understand what indeed needs to be done. But this, and just for you as scientists, just to say so why do we remove nitrogen and phosphorus from our treated water or from our sludge? Why do we do so? We did it because we assumed that we would be ecologically mindless and take that treated water and put it into rivers. But if you're going to put it back on land, you need the nitrogen and phosphorus. You're actually first removing it and then putting it back again. So those are the ways in which science will have to be much more agile, nimble, forward-looking as we move ahead. Agriculture is a fascinating example in our world. And John and I were part of a jury last year where we were discussing this. And I have a problem with organic agriculture because I loved organic agriculture. And then I found it was becoming the agriculture of the elite in India, just like electric vehicles is becoming. Where it's unaffordable food eaten by some, oh, I eat organic agriculture food. I'm like, okay, so what about the farmer? Do you pay the farmer for the ordinary food that they grow? And remember, in our part of the world, we have such a dual challenge. We're a poor country, our regions of the world. Our governments need to procure food. That procurement has to be cheap. Okay? So when the price of food goes up, the government of India imports it from other parts of the world. And that means that the same farmer who would have benefited from the expensive food now again loses out. And that's where the EU farm subsidies have to play a role in that conversation. Because we distort the economies of the very poor. And that's where they discount their land and they have to take as much out of their land. And that's where the crisis comes in terms of the increased inputs that they have. So today in the state of Andhra Pradesh, which is an award that John and I were part of a jury has given, has actually reinvented that agriculture at scale. And the argument there is reduce the input cost. Because if you reduce the input cost, you basically end up with getting more income in the hands of farmers. To reduce the input cost, you have to focus on soil, not on input. You have to focus on the quality of soil. So the regenerative agriculture buzz that we talk about is really about regenerating the soils. And we need to understand what that will take in our world. I heard yesterday a lot of work that you're doing also on biodiversity. I just want to say for us, the biodiversity conversation is about habitats of our people. That the world will never be able to do 30-30 unless you can really deepen the relationship so that people benefit from the biodiversity. And that really is something that we are arguing, saying, build a forest-based economy, build a plant-based economy. And that if you're talking about, this is very uniquely Indian, so don't look at me with such, this is very uniquely Indian, that our foresters will argue with you that wood is not to be cut. And my argument with them is grow the wood, cut the wood, grow it again. And they say because of the high population pressure and the grazing pressure, the wood does not grow. So this is a whole conservation debate which we have got where people are the biotic pressure, where we need to keep people out because we need forests to be maintained for us. I thought many of you would be interested in the coal question. So I just wanted to point out that for us, the question is not coal. The question is, how can we get clean energy in a way that we can meet the needs of large numbers of people? We need energy access in our world. So the Indian government actually has come up with a very interesting policy, which is we are not going to replace coal, but we are going to displace coal. So we will increase our energy consumption between now and 2030. We will double it, but that doubling will happen on clean energy. And for me, therefore, the conversation that we have to have is to become real and say that can countries like India, which are 75% dependent on coal today, actually just switch and switch at a time when they need to double their energy consumption? Or do we need a different conversation? I will not argue the same for Germany. Please be clear. Remember my pie diagram. Germany, Austria, Europe, America have a different issue. But in our world, the question is, how can we meet the challenges of development, energy access, and clean energy? As a member of the Supreme Court's committee, we actually closed down the last coal-based power plant in Delhi because we said that it is bad for local air pollution. So I'm not a coal apologist, but I'm simply saying to you that this switch, this JET-P model, we'll get rid of South Africa's coal. South Africa is desperate for energy. Talk about it with real terms in terms of how you will finance. So this is the report we put out last year, where we showed how the Indian government plan is to reduce the dependence from 75% to 30% in terms of the units, the generation of coal to RE. We are also arguing with the Indian government that right now the plan is not working. We are not ramping up renewable energy at the scale we need. So the issue is not coal. The issue is ramping up cleaner sources of energy so that coal becomes marginal. That's got to be the approach. The question has to be, why can't we ramp up cleaner sources of energy? And that's where the cost of financing comes up. That's where the question about the displacement of clean energy by coal becomes an important issue with dispatch centers. The Spain example becomes an important example. So those are the questions that we need to resolve. So finally, I just want to say that for me, the biggest issue and the biggest roadblock in everything we do is imagination, is the lack of imagination. And we need to make sure that we have both the politics of inclusion and imagination. Then when we talk about the clean air agenda in our part of the world, we talk about mobility. When you talk about forest agenda, you talk about a wood-based economy. You talk about agriculture, you talk about livelihoods of farmers and soil. When you talk about waste, you talk about not wasting waste. So these are tough times, as I said right at the beginning. We're all impacted by them. But I believe there are also times with great opportunity. And the opportunity is for people who will have the courage to take on new ideas. If we are status quoist in how we think and do things, then the Donald Trumps of the world will prevail. But if we are able to take the ideas head on to say, yes, there is a problem with how we will supply energy at affordable rates, then we will do so. And this is our imperative. We know environment is about survival, is not about luxury, but survival. We also know the threat of climate change is real. So if that is the case, then we have to prevail. We cannot become footprints in history. Thank you very much.